is May 31st, 2007, and Mr. Ronald Story has generously donated his time to talk with us about his time that he served in the military between 1952 and 1954.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about your life a little before you got drafted?
Yes, my life, I lived practically all of my life up to that time in Lowell, and lived at beside where the funeral home is here now, 223 North Hudson Street. Moved there when I was just an infant, went all through Lowell schools, graduated in 1950 from Lowell High School, and at that time, during high school, I usually worked in garages, local garages. I worked in the Pontiac garage, and I also worked in the Buick and Chevrolet garage those years, primarily as a parts person. I went to Davenport College when I got out of high school and got what would be now an associate's degree in business. And then in September of 1952, which was just a little over 2 years after I graduated from high school, I was drafted for 2 years into the Army. The Korean War was going on at that time, so everybody of my age that was physically able was drafted. So it's something that I knew was coming for several months or years ahead of time, just waiting for the right time. And finally in September of 1952, my time came.
Were you really nervous?
Oh, I wasn't nervous about it, although I thought for sure I was going to end up in Korea and end up in the battle. And fortunately for me, I did not. But most of my friends that went in did end up in Korea, those that went overseas. And I felt much more fortunate than them, having gone to Europe instead of to Korea in those days. Here over 50 years later, we still have the troops in Korea. So even though way back in those days a lot of the people were going to Korea, a lot of them are still there today.
What was basic training like?
Basic training was very difficult, I will say, because it was long hours, hard work, physical work, because we had to do a lot of calisthenics, and we had to go through obstacle courses, and we had to learn to shoot a rifle, and just basically learn an awful lot about the military and about soldiering. But we also had to learn at that time military discipline, and that was one of the things that they taught us very well. And that is an experience that you carry throughout life, because many of the discipline things and things you learn in those days, you do carry throughout life. They throw together people from all walks of life, from all over the country, all kinds of backgrounds, and try to mold them into a unit of productive people that can work together. At the same time, they have to teach us discipline, and to many people who never knew discipline or were not disciplined. And that was tough. It wasn't tough on me because learning discipline was not difficult for me. I had always worked and knew that hard work paid off, and so and kept you out of trouble. So it wasn't as difficult for me as it was for others. But it was very grueling days, because people in basic training, your leaders, your trainers, would be very mean people. They had to be mean. That was their job, because they were whipping up a bunch of undisciplined people and trying to totally turn around their outlook on life. So they worked us very hard, and they talked rough to us, and so we had to learn to take it without getting angry, and to deal with it and deal with your fellow person. If somebody was having trouble, you would oftentimes help them out as you could. So they taught us to work together as a group. And I would think that's the objective of the basic training and what it does accomplish with things. stories about basic training, how it is. This is repetition for you, perhaps, but I think like what we went on, what is called bivouac. And on bivouac, you go out, you take all your material, and you walk for miles and miles, and you stay overnight in a tent and with a bedroll and things like that. And I was at Fort Riley, Kansas, and there I remember the first time we went out for bivouac. We put on a 40-pound backpack on your back and carried an M1 rifle. I forget what it weighed, but it was a lot. And we walked as a group for 8 miles, which seemed to me was straight uphill. And then we spent, I think, 3 days out there eating sometimes ration, which would be cave rations or something like that, not your regular hot cooked food. And then when we turned around to walk the 8 miles back, it seemed like it was still uphill all the way back, as well as it had been uphill all the way out there. So that it's because, of course, it's hilly land, but it just seemed that way when you were carrying all that weight and walking at a speed that a short guy with me with short legs, trying to keep up with the others, was not very easy. A story that I remember of one time when we went out on a bivouac, which was at least 3 days, and I remember it was cold and it was rainy at Fort Riley, and before going into the service, I would never eat liver, and I couldn't stand the smell or the appearance of liver. And we were out for this 3 or 4 days, walked back with this pack and got back into camp in the evening, cold, tired, hot, and starved to death, and went to the mess hall, and the meal was a nice liver dinner. I ate the liver and had never had a more delicious meal in my life, and have eaten liver ever since. So that's kind of a basic training story that I remember.
Did you make a lot of friends?
Made a lot of friends. Some of the friends that I made there are still friends. Some of my Army friends I still we exchanged Christmas cards at Christmas, and as we got home, we continued to write regularly, kept up on time when each other got married, when we had children, what was happening in our lives. And yes, we have, and there are some of them that I'm still in contact with today, some 53 years later.
You said you were stationed in Europe during the Korean War?
Yes, I was stationed in La Rochelle, France. And the reason was in 1952 and 53 and 54 when I went in, even though the fighting was all taking place in Korea, it was soon enough after World War II that there was still a lot of things over there that needed occupational forces, which we were, but also there was the constant fear that war was going to break out again in Europe. We were not getting along with the Russians at all, and with dividing things up, dividing the country up after World War II created a lot of friction, especially with the Russians. And we just felt that any day that, or they felt any day that the war would break out again. And that's one reason there were a lot of people stationed in Europe, not only to be there in case something did break out, but as a deterrent to prevent something from breaking out. The reason we were in La Rochelle, France, was that the main route to get supplies, materials, and soldiers and stuff into Europe were through the ports in Bremerhaven, Germany. And they knew that in case war broke out, the very first thing that the Russians would do would destroy Bremerhaven and would destroy that as a port and as a supply route. So they picked La Rochelle as a secondary supply route that in case the main supply route in Northern Europe was taken out of commission, that this supply route would be there and take over. One of the reasons that was an advantage is because Hitler had built a submarine base, a mammoth submarine base, near La Rochelle. And I have been all through those submarine bases, and the concrete is so thick you can't believe it. As well as the coast there, every mile or so will have a large gun emplacement with concrete heavy enough that it probably, if a bomb hit it, it would not penetrate it and put it out of commission. So all of that reinforcement left over from World War II was there, which made it a better place to defend a port. But primarily, I would say the submarine pins, they called them, and placements there was probably the reason that La Rochelle was picked as a secondary port city.
What was some of the work that you did?
Okay, I worked since I had gone to Davenport and taken business type of courses before I went in. And then they singled me out to be what's called a clerk typist. And when I finished my basic training, then I went into clerk typist school, again right there in Fort Riley, where we not only perfected our typing skills and our business skills, but also learned to do it in a military way to maintain military records. In those days, everything was done with mimeograph machines, and we used a gel-based stencil. And with that, we would take a typewriter without a ribbon, and we'd cut everything we needed into that stencil, and that would hit and cut through the gel so ink would flow through it. And then we'd go to what in those days was a mimeograph machine, which was full of ink, and the ink would come out. And that's how we printed things, because that was before computers, Word for Windows, or even photocopy machines existed. So that was the most practical way of doing it. And so that's what we did at Clerk Typist School, is learned to do the military type of office work and record keeping, because the military keeps very good records. And halfway back to the Revolutionary War and before, you find in Washington, D.C., is still extensive records of practically every soldier that was there and material on them. And the records over the years have just improved from there. So it took a lot of us to work in what was called personnel section to take care of all these records and printing all of these orders, the clerical work that goes along with that. So while we were at Fort Riley at the Clerk Typist School, we were in also an area where they also had an Army Cook School. And so the Army Cook trainees and their instructors cooked our meals. Therefore, we ate very well during those years, better than most of the people in the military.
What was your day-to-day life like? Wow.
Overseas in the service? Well, since I worked in an office, and I worked in personnel record of the officers, so the officers of the organization, and it was the 28th General Hospital, and since it was a hospital unit, it had a lot of doctors and a lot of professional medical people, pharmacists, optometrists, you name it. And those people were all professional people, so they were officers. And so my job was primarily to keep their records. Well, that was it. And it was just a regular office setting, and it was kind of a 9 to 5, 5-day-a-week situation. And where we lived, or we had tents, as some of these pictures will show, but we also had some what would today would be called a temporary building. They were built in England, and they were, I think, made out of asbestos, so they probably wouldn't be legal today, because some of us probably got cancer from living in them. But it was pretty much just like living in maybe in a motel, but most of us lived in one great big room. And we had regular bathrooms and showers and running water and things like that. So the 9 to 5, 5 days a week would be working in the office. Go back in the evening. We had an enlisted man's club there in the base that I was on, and sometimes we'd go down there in the evening and maybe have a beer or a pop. We had a little movie house, and we would get fairly current movies. They showed them, I think, with a 16-millimeter projector, so it was the focus and the sound and everything was very poor, but we would oftentimes go to a show, and I did an awful lot of reading in those days. I remember that every week I would read Time magazine from cover to cover, and by that I mean every word in it, advertisement, every article, and everything. which kept me rather well informed of what was going on in the world. And then, since I did work a 5-day week, I generally had the weekends off. And since I was not too far a train ride from Paris, I would oftentimes on a weekend, maybe Friday night when work was done, go down La Rochelle, jump on the train, and take it to Paris. And then Sunday night come back, ready to go to work Monday morning. Another thing I did while I was there, because I got quite a little leave time, and I took a lot of trips throughout Europe on leave time with fellow buddies in the service, and we would plan ahead and say, well, let's go to Spain, or let's go to Italy, or what have you. So as a result, I did extensive travel of Europe in those days. Some of the travel I would fly on military planes, because we could go to a military Air Force base and hop on a military plane that happened to be going someplace. But most of the travel was by train. And the trains in Europe were excellent. And so, as I say, when we go to Paris for the weekend, I just go down, jump on the train, and go.
What was your life like at that time? Was it still really hurt from the World War II?
What the country of Europe was like? Yes, it was. It was after World War II, but it was soon enough after that the injuries to the people and to the cities and the countryside was still obvious. There were plenty of scars around in buildings, in roads, and monuments, scars of World War II. And so we could see that most everywhere I went.
You said you went to Paris a lot? What was it like at that time?
Well, Paris was probably a lot like it is right now. The clubs, there was like the Lido Club and the Folie Bergère that have been in existence for, I don't know, probably 100 years or so. They were then there. It was interesting to see the artists, because you'd go down by Notre Dame Cathedral, and there would be artists working all over the place. There would be street musicians. But the buildings and the museums and the churches were so fascinating because they were such tremendous buildings, and been through most of them.
Out of all the places that you went while in service, like on your travels on the weekends, what was your favorite?
Well, probably of the favorite places I went, I liked Italy so well because I've got to spend time in Rome, Pompeii, Capri, Amalfi, been to Florence, and Florence is a fantastic city. Saw the Leaning Tower of Pisa, been to Venice, and ridden around the little boats in Venice. Did all those things that I never would have gotten to do if I had not been in the service. And thinking of my friends and buddies who were all over in Korea, crawling around on their bellies, carrying a gun, and I was over in Europe doing those things and really had it pretty well. But necessary that we be there.
Do you have any personal stories that you'd like to share about Italy? Or
about Italy, I'm trying to think Italy. I can remember so many things about it, being fascinated by the Roman Forum and by Pompeii, and going to Capri and the seeing places like that to a kid, because see, I was just in my very early 20s then, and for a young kid to have the opportunity to see those things, it was a very maturing experience. And I think I did an awful lot of growing up during those 2 years, and an awful lot of planning on how I was going to spend the rest of my life. And I think that probably every day of my life is probably influenced somehow by the things I learned or the decisions that I made in that time that I applied to my later life and set my goals for what I wanted to be.
What were your feelings on having a lot of your friends go off to Korea and you being kind of the select feeling?
Well, I guess my feeling was great relief because it could just as well have been me. And why I was selected for Europe, because at that time probably a third or a quarter of us went to Europe and the rest of them went to Korea. It's possible to when I went into this service, I went into Grand Rapids. We went to Grand Rapids. Are those arms getting... All right. When I left Lowell, we went to Grand Rapids and took a bus to Detroit. And from there, we took a bus to Fort Custer near Battle Creek. And at Fort Custer, we were then officially taken into the Army, issued our clothes, given our shots, given our haircuts, had our medical tests and dental work evaluated at that time. And then after being there about a week, then we took the train to Fort Riley, Kansas. And at Fort Riley is where the basic training was. When I got my notice to report to the Army, we reported at the Armory on Michigan Street in Grand Rapids. And from there, they put us on a bus and took us to Detroit. And from there, they bused us to Fort Custer at Battle Creek. And we were there about a week. At that time, we got our shots, we got our haircuts, we got our teeth fixed, and was issued all of our clothing and basic things. From there, we took the train to Fort Riley, Kansas, where I took my basic training and also took the Court Type School. When I was finished with that, I was able to come home on a short leave, and after the leave, report to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. From Camp Kilmer, they took us by bus to Staten Island. We took the Staten Island ferry over to to one of the piers in Manhattan, and from there we got on a troop ship and took the troop ship to Europe. And with the troop ship, it was very interesting, fascinated me, was coming up through the English Channel and up through the Narrows here, the White Cliffs of Dover. I remember how fascinated I was with the White Cliffs of Dover. And then from there we came up to Bremerhaven, Germany, and from Bremerhaven we took the train down to Zweibrücken, what was the reception center for all of the troops coming into Europe. There they evaluated us and sent us to the camps that we were going to be assigned to during our tour there. And with me, they offered me a job at Zweibrücken, or they offered me to take my chances of going someplace else. And I thought it would be good to take my chances, so I did. And I was assigned down to a general hospital, 28th General Hospital in La Rochelle, France, which was down on the Bay of Biscay in the Atlantic Ocean. And as I have said, the reason La Rochelle is important because it was a secondary supply route in case of war again in Europe, and also was so well fortified during World War II by the Nazis because they could just move in and take over what was then the submarine pens, the reinforcement of the coast, and everything. But the advantage of being here was the trains in Europe are excellent, and I could easily get on a train any day and go to Paris. And I went to Paris practically every weekend because the type of work that I was in, I had weekends off, and I would go up there. But other trips I took because I had leave time, and usually with friends. For example, when Queen Elizabeth was coronated as Queen of England, I was there, and I was able to go to London that day. So I stood at, I think, as I recall, Piccadilly Circus, which is a part of London, and stood there, and the Queen and her carriage and the entourage went probably within 15 or 20 feet of where I was standing. And I do have somewhere a lot of the pictures that I took. So that was one of the trips that I took. Another time I went up to Paris and flew to London on a military plane, flew to Madrid, Spain, spent several days in Madrid, and from there flew, I'm going to say, into I believe, Frankfurt, Germany. I haven't got my glasses on because I can't read this map. Other trips I've taken took me through Holland, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, pretty much all through Italy, Switzerland, Spain. So I did extensive traveling of Europe on my leave time there. Spent a lot of time down on the Mediterranean, down at Nice and Cannes and Monaco. And back in those days, it's much different than it was now because, again, it was just a few years after World War II. But the gambling casinos in Monaco were still very nice and still very much in business, as were the beaches along the Mediterranean. Can we rest your arms now?
Do you have any personal stories that you'd like to share with us about maybe some friends that you made, or maybe some of the people that you met while in Europe?
Well, yes, the friends that I made, I did not make any European type of friends while there. All of the friends that I made were fellow military people or soldiers, but some real good friendships there, and lived together with their problems at home because many of them were married. Some of them had kids, small kids. Some of them, their wives had babies while they were gone, and they kind of shared those emotional times with them. And I can think of several of those. One good friend of mine, I can think that his little baby girl fell and was injured, and here he was over in France, and there's absolutely nothing he could do about it. Another friend whose son had to have surgery when we were there. And I remember one friend from New York, and his mother died, and he didn't have any money, and he was really upset about it, and he could get the leave time, but he couldn't get home. So I remember I was able to lend him money so he could go home to his mother's funeral. And so there are a lot of that type of stories, and everything like that has emotion tied to it because it's a different emotional experience than I'd ever had before. To be there, first of all, so far from home. And even though I had a lot of friends, they were all newly made friends because there was nobody that I had ever met before. I couldn't go anywhere and see anybody that I had known for, say, 2 years before that particular time. So it was a time to learn to make new friends. But another thing, the variation of people. There are people that you virtually love to be around, and there are people that you prefer not to be around. But in the Army, you're thrown in with all of them. And if you're smart, you have to learn to get along with all of them. Because if you don't, you're still going to have to live with them. And people who fight and get into trouble, it makes it very difficult because they cannot get out of the situation. They're going to have to remain there.
Did you have a lot of problems, did you miss your family a lot while over there?
Well, yes, I missed my family. We wrote back and forth. In fact, preparing for this, I went back. I've got folders just full of letters back and forth, and it was very interesting to read those letters and what I had to say and what was coming over to me. My family kept me very well informed of what was going on with the family and with my siblings, and so that helped because there would generally be a letter every few days, and I was quite good about writing letters back to them also. And as I say, I've still got many of those letters, so I can go back and I can kind of relive those years by pulling those letters out and reading them. And then after I got out, I communicated and corresponded very regularly with the friends I'd made in the Army, because those friends that you make under emotional circumstances like that seem to be pretty much a special friend.
You said you were done in 1954?
I got out in September of 1954. I was drafted for 2 years, and when the 2 years was up, I was out, And but they do keep you in the reserves for, I think, either 6 or 8 years, which means I could be called back at any time, which wouldn't happen unless there were a war or something had come up where they needed people. So we knew that it was pretty safe that I was not going to be called back, and fortunately wasn't. So I could come back, reestablish my life, since I'd been in the automobile parts business before. I went in. I came back. I went to work for Virgin Chevrolet in Grand Rapids in parts, but I only worked there for about 3 months because the people at the bank here in Lowell had told me for a couple of years that they was going to make a banker out of me someday, and they offered me a job, and I took a cut of pay and went to work in the bank in Lowell, and worked there for nearly 3 years. When I left to take a job in the bank in Ionia, and I spent the rest of my career there. Keep this hand here.
Are there any important lessons or values that you learned in the military that you could apply to your life after?
Well, I sure can. I learned about being able to get along with all kinds of people. And even people that I was not comfortable with or didn't particularly like, I still made a point to get along with them. And so that was the kind of a technique I had to learn, because before in my life, if you had situations like that, you could just avoid that person or that situation. In the military, you can't always do that. You have to live with it and learn to live with it.
Do you have any personal stories about after you got out that kind of that helped you, that maybe related to your time in the military or reminded you at all?
The only thing that I would think about then of when I got out was that many of my friends that went in the same time I did, even though we went in totally different directions, were getting out also. So we were getting together and renewing our friendships, but things were not the same because people they were more serious about their work. Many of them were getting married, getting in serious relationships. So it wasn't the old buddy-buddy system that it was before. We were still friends. We still did a lot of things together, but it was on a different level, in a different way. In those days, of course, I was trying to establish a career, working very hard, learning more. I went back to Davenport and took more courses. And then when I got in the banking business, I started education all over, because it was schools and classes most all of the time, getting more into law and mortgage business and lending business and all this type of special courses that I would take.
Were you affected emotionally by serving in the military at all?
I think I was. Emotionally, I learned to be, I think, more compassionate, but more considerate of other people's feelings and needs. Whereas I can remember in high school, I don't think that was much of a concern of mine. But by the time I got in the military and those situations, then you looked at things entirely differently emotionally, and you looked at life much different. And you had goals set. It wasn't so loose. That's a very important thing that the military did, was I think that taught many people how to lay out a blueprint for the rest of their lives. And many people did that. Some people cracked from it. Some people would maybe become alcoholics. I saw a lot of that in the service because they just couldn't deal with these emotional things without the crutch or the help of alcohol or something like that to get their mind off what was really going on. But I never participated in that. I drank some beer, but never into excess or anything like that. And some of them did, because I would see people come in who had never had a drink before in their life, and they get there in those emotional situations and would lose control and would overdrink and probably ruin that section of their lives because of it. But it's all of that part of the of learning to deal with your own problems.
You said that in the military, everyone had time to set goals and stuff. What were some of the goals?
Everyone? No, not everyone. Absolutely not. No, some people did, but most of the people, like myself, did set goals. The ones that weren't married or didn't have a regular girlfriend, they would think about what they wanted in their marriage, what they wanted the rest of life to be, when they were going to get married, how many kids they wanted, all those kind of things that they maybe hadn't thought about before. I came out with some goals, and the goals always proved at that time that to do these things that you needed the proper education and the hard work to make it happen or to accomplish it. So that's where I think it turned a lot of lives around. It made people more productive and made their lives more meaningful, because if they achieved some of the goals that they had set, then those milestones inspired people to be different. And the GI Bill, and I came under the GI Bill, changed things because many of the people that went into World War II came from families that did not consider a college education necessary, because in the early years it was not. And when they got out, the GI Bill provided them with an education. And many of them came back, they didn't have work, and they didn't know what they were going to do, and so many people coming back all at once, there was not job openings for them. So in some cases, to fill in their time, they took advantage of the GI Bill and went to college. And I think it just tremendously upgraded the population of the United States, that all of a sudden, such a much higher percentage of the young people in the country were getting an education, getting a college education, and maybe high school teachers moving up to be college teachers to take care of them. It just brought up the level of everything and brought up the level of so many lives. It really made a tremendous change on the economy of living in the United States, and also just brought up our standard of living tremendously.
What were, if you don't mind me asking, what were some maybe personal goals that the military influenced you to have?
Oh yes, I had goals. What I remember doing when I got out, I wanted to come back, get a good job. I wanted to improve my education. One of the first things I did was to sign up under the GI Bill through the Veterans Administration to go to Michigan State, because I had this associate's degree from Davenport, but to go to Michigan State and get a degree and probably become a CPA or something like that. The State Savings Bank, it was down the street where we're sitting, Harry Day ran it, and Harry told me, I can teach you an awful lot in the next 4 years, and Michigan State will. So I went to work for Harry Day. And Harry Day did give me an education, saw me a good educator, gave me the opportunities to get education as well as the on-the-job training I got there. And I was there for, as I say, about 4 years before I moved into Ionian to the bank, where my education continued. Well, that need for a solid job like that and the education was one of those goals that I set. I also wanted to own a nice home. I wanted to get married, and I had no girlfriends or anything in those days. Get married, raise a family, and just live a comfortable life. And soon thereafter, I bought a house before I was married up on the 810 Riverside Drive in Lowell, Michigan, where Jan Johnson now lives. I sold that house to Phil and Jan when we moved. Jan still lives there. So I was able to buy that house, I guess, when I was, I was probably about 24 years old when I bought that house. So you see, that was another goal of mine, to own my own home. And a very decent one, and I have a good job, and I had a good solid job in the bank. I didn't pay a lot, but it took care of everything I needed. And then I got married, and then I started having kids. Ended up having 4 kids, and So all of these goals that I was thinking about then is all accomplished because now I have a successful family. My children are all successful. I have 11 grandchildren that are all, most of them getting their educations now. But if you revert that back, if you go right back to what I can think of what I wanted my life to be, what I got out, and it was pretty well accomplished. In other words, be careful of the goals you set because they'll probably come true.
Did you ever return back to Europe to revisit the places that?
I have never visited many of those places. I have been to Europe. I've been there 3 times in the last 6 years, and traveled some of the same country I've been in. But I have not been in France, where I spent most of my time. But I've been into many of the other countries. I don't know how many countries I've probably been in, maybe 15 or 20 countries in the last 6 years, but none of them in France. But any of them that I've been in before, yes, England, Germany. I haven't been back to Switzerland or Italy. That probably would be my next trip to go to Italy. So, yes, been back, but not to see the old places. Someday I should go back to La Rochelle. I probably won't recognize it, but to see how it's changed. I wouldn't know anybody there. I did know some French people while I was there, but I'm sure they're all long gone.
So you said you went back to did you go back to London or?
Went back to London about 6 years ago. Went back to London and toured completely all of the British Isles, and traveled all over England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and did all those countries 6 years ago. Then 4 years ago, went back and took a boat on the pretty much on the Rhine and Danube rivers from Amsterdam, which is in Holland, to Vienna, Austria. Then last year, we again took a boat, flew into Bucharest, Romania, went over to the Black Sea, and then took a boat all the way up to Budapest, Hungary, and I don't know, we were in 9 or 10 countries, ended up in Prague, which is the Czech Republic, and came home from there. So I've seen an awful lot of Europe, not only when I was there, but I've seen a fair share of it since. But to get back to La Rochelle and the old stomping grounds, someday maybe if my health holds up.
Did you find when you went back to London and some of the places that you were, did you find the attitude of the people and maybe like the landscape to be different at all?
I don't think so. In London, the people have always liked us. And I didn't see a lot of difference in the people in London, just a lot busier and more hustle-bustle. In London, I'd usually take a taxi to get around, and that's pretty much the same, except the traffic is just so much more tremendous. Going back to London this time, one thing, we flew in and went right to our hotel when we got in London. And so when we got unpacked, I said to my wife, let's take a walk. We walked down the street, and all of a sudden kind of this great big park and this great big building, and here's a wall just filled with flowers. And so I said, well, let's go and see what that is. Well, it was the tribute to Diana, because that was soon after Diana had been killed. And that was really something to see how those people loved Diana and the tributes that they had there for her. So that was one thing I remember most of my last trip to London.
So the first time when you went in the military, you saw the coronation.
First time, I went to London twice. One time I went there to catch a plane to go to Madrid, Spain. And then the other time was when we went over to the coronation. And there had a hotel. And they mentioned that it's you go down on the street, and they went down to what's called Piccadilly Circus and stood there because the parade come by. And of course, this parade just took a couple of hours, and all of the military people and all the dignitaries from all over the world were there. And of course, Elizabeth went by, and Elizabeth in her carriage probably was within 15 feet of me.
Oh, wow.
And I have pictures, I didn't bring them, of that I took of Elizabeth as she went by on her coronation day.
Oh, that must have been cool.
Yes, that was cool. Quite an experience for about a 23-year-old boy from Lowell, Michigan. Yes, it was.
Do you have any advice, to young people now graduating from high school?
Well, I do. In that, what do you have for an experience to offer you an opportunity to evaluate your life and set your priorities? And to do it, you almost have to get out of your existing environment and make a break. And in those days, the military didn't, because you were zapped, pulled instantly away from your family, away from your community, away from your friends, and thrown into an entirely new situation. And it makes you look at life much different. Nowadays, it's college has to pretty much fill that in. So, of course, my advice for people, I think that education in this day and age is absolutely essential. It wasn't in the days when I was in high school, as much so as it is today. And I've worked very much in education all of my years since, and I'm still. Well, this morning, 8 o'clock this morning, I was in a meeting in Greenville, Michigan, because I'm on the foundation board of the Montcalm Community College. And so I'm at the Montcalm Community College, either in Greenville at the Sydney campus, probably average of at least once a month at meetings. I'm still involved in it. And I've had many things involved in education. So I guess I would be known, since I got a plaque, and the only one they ever gave by the Michigan Higher Education Council, for my work in education, and it's the only one they've ever given a plaque to in the state of Michigan. So I guess I could say that I've been rather involved in education of different types, primarily banking education. The banking education I mentioned when I got it, there's the American Institute of Banking, and I was the Michigan president for the Michigan education for several years. The best banking school is Michigan. In Michigan is the banking school at Central Michigan University, and I'm a past president of the banking school up there. So education has just been so important in all of my life, and it continues to be, even though I'm this old and been in it this long. So advice I would have is set your priorities and get your education, but be sure that the education is compatible with what you want to be, and be sure that your education is something that's marketable, that there is or going to be a demand for.
Do you have any advice maybe to the kids that are thinking about going into the military to get a career out of it, or just? I would not discourage anybody from going into the military. Anybody that was even thinking about it, I would say do it. In fact, my own grandchildren. I've got a grandchild that I have recommended. I think that a few years in the service would be a great thing for you. Certainly there's risk involved in it, but there are also some real advantages too, especially for somebody that doesn't have their priorities straightened out for them yet. By all means, go into the service. If you have something that you want to be, nowadays you can oftentimes get a position in the military along the line that you think. For example, if you want to be in medical, you can
and go in and want to be and ask to be in the medical part, and chances are you will be. Some people want to go into aircraft or what have you, and the military will educate you, and then give you some Veterans Administration benefits for getting more education later. So, oh yes, education is so important to me that you've hit a hot button when you got me talking about that.
Is there anything that from your military time in the military that you would redo or take back?
Well, it's a thing. I would not have missed my military experience for anything. It was wonderful years, good and bad, but wonderful. The bad things were educational. They molded me to what I am. I feel I'm so fortunate that I had my military experience, but I wouldn't want to do it again. Once was enough. But to encourage young people, by all means, I wish they would all go and get as much benefit from it as I got.
And do you think travel is is a very important thing that kids have to experience?
I think travel is so important. And I see that with the work now. In fact, I see that, as I say, my work with Montcalm Community College. Some of those high school graduates that come to the community college to further their education, they have young people coming there that have never been out of Montcalm County, have never been in a big city. And this is a big world out here. And I can't believe that these people are missing that and that their lives do not include that. And that's another thing that the education does. That generally it gets them out of this close little world they live in and show them the other things there really is to this world and to this life.
Do you think a lot of your passion for education kind of started with the military in your time served there?
It probably was, because it became much more serious after I was in the service than it was before. Again, as soon as I graduated from Lowell High School, I went right down the next term and started at Davenport. But I didn't have the ambition to go ahead and get a degree at that time. An associate's degree was perfectly fine, adequate with me. But by the time I got out of the military, that's why I went over and enrolled through the GI Bill at Michigan State, and probably would have gone there and got at least a bachelor's degree had not Harry Day said, "I'll teach you more in the next 4 years than they will," and he did.
Well, thank you very much for donating your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Appreciate it.
The following oral military history project is a series of documentaries in association with the Lowell area men and women who proudly served and sacrificed part of their lives to preserve the opportunities for all of us to build our businesses and raise our families under a blanket of freedom. For reservations and more information, contact the Lowell Area Historical Museum at 616-897-7688.